What would you do if you walked up to a vehicle, the engine cold, the door closed, and found that everyone inside had simply vanished in a thin air? Not a single sign of struggle. A half-finished cup of coffee, still warm. Lunchboxes waiting to be opened. But no driver and no children. This isn't a scene from a movie. This is exactly what happened on a quiet morning in 1961, when a school bus with 24 souls on board became a ghost ship on the side of a lonely road. For 20 years, there were no answers, only a gaping hole in the heart of a small town. And then, when all hope was lost, the impossible happened. The driver came back. This is the true story of the Millwood mystery, a case that redefines everything we think we know about disappearances. If you're captivated by this real-life mystery, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our deep dives into the world's most unsolved and eerie cases. We have so many more stories to tell. Now, we have a question for you. Where in the world are you watching this from? Let us know down in the comments. Just type the name of your city. We read every single one. The morning of November 14th, 1961, began like any other in the small, tight-knit town of Millwood. A low, gray sky promised a cold rain later, and a brisk wind sent fallen leaves skittering across the neatly kept lawns of Elm Street. At 7:15 a.m., the familiar yellow bus, number 42, pulled to its regular stop. The doors hissed open, and children, their breaths forming little clouds in the chilly air, filed on board. At the wheel was Thomas "Tom" Grady, a man known to every family on his route. At 48 years old, he was a fixture in the community, reliable as the sunrise. He had driven Bus 42 for 12 years without a single incident. He knew each child by name, knew which ones needed a reminder to sit down, and which ones were still half asleep and needed a gentle nudge to find seat. That morning, he waved to Mrs. Henderson as her son, Bobby, climbed aboard. "Morning, Tommy," she called out, as she did every morning. Tom tipped his cap and gave her a warm smile. "Morning, Sarah. Looks like we're in for some wet weather today." It was the most ordinary of exchanges, one that would later be remembered with a sharp, painful clarity. The bus continued its route, picking up more children. Everything was perfectly, utterly normal. The bus was about 3/4 full, carrying 23 children aged between 6 and 12, on its way to Millwood Elementary School. The final stop was at the corner of Maple and Vine, where the Larson twins got on. The time was 7:38 a.m. The bus then made the turn onto Old Mill Road, the last stretch of its route before arriving at the school. Old Mill Road was a lonely, tree-lined stretch of asphalt that cut through a thick patch of woodland, a 2-mile corridor between the town's outskirts and the school. It was along this road that the ordinary morning curdled into a mystery that would haunt the town for decades. At approximately 7:45 a.m., a farmer named Walter Higgins, driving his tractor along a lane that paralleled Old Mill Road, saw Bus 42. It was parked on a wide gravel shoulder, its red stop lights blinking. This was not unusual. Tom often stopped there if a child was feeling sick or if there was some minor mechanical issue. Higgins thought nothing of it and continued on his way. 10 minutes later, at 7:55 a.m., the school's head secretary, Dorothy Finch, received a call from a confused teacher asking why the first bell had rung, but the kindergarten class was nearly empty. Dorothy immediately called the home of Tom Grady, thinking he might be running late, but his wife, Eleanor, said he had left on time as always. A low thread of anxiety began to weave through the school's office. By 8:15 a.m., with the bus now 40 minutes late, the anxiety had turned to full-blown alarm. The principal, Mr. Abbott, got in his car and began to drive the route. He found Bus 42 exactly where Farmer Higgins had seen it, parked neatly on the shoulder of Old Mill Road. The engine was off. The door was closed. The interior was empty and silent. There was no sign of Tom Grady. There was no sign of any of the 23 children. The only sound was the wind whispering through the tall pines and the steady drip, drip, drip of rainwater from the bus's roof. Mr. Abbott's heart hammered against his ribs as he climbed aboard. The bus was pristine. School books and lunchboxes sat neatly on seats. A half-eaten apple rested on the dashboard. On the floor near the driver's seat was Tom Grady's thermos, the coffee inside still warm. It was as if the entire contents of the bus, the driver, and 24 children had simply evaporated into the cold November air. The ensuing search was one of the largest in the state's history. Police, volunteers, and later the National Guard combed every inch of the dense woodland surrounding Old Mill Road. They waded through creeks and thick underbrush. Bloodhounds were brought in, but their handlers reported a frustrating confusion of scents. The children had been everywhere on that shoulder, waiting to be picked up. The dogs would pick up a trail only for it to stop abruptly, as if the person had been lifted into the sky. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Dive teams searched the murky waters of the old mill pond. Nothing, not a single scrap of clothing, not a footprint in the soft mud, not a cry for help. The 24 souls had disappeared without a trace. Theories erupted like wildfires, each more desperate than the last. There was talk of a mass kidnapping, though no ransom note ever arrived. There was speculation about a sudden, catastrophic accident, but no evidence of one could be found. Some whispered about top-secret government experiments or even something otherworldly. The police investigation, led by a weary and determined Chief Robert Evans, hit wall after wall. They interviewed every resident, followed up on every supposed sighting, and dug into Tom Grady's life. But Tom was a simple man. He had no debts, no enemies, no secret life. He loved his wife, enjoyed fishing on the weekends, and was devoted to his job. He was, by all accounts, the last person on Earth who would willingly involved in something sinister. The case grew cold, a permanent frost settling over Millwood. The empty bus, eventually towed to an impound lot, became a grim relic. The town tried to move on, but the absence of answers was a ghost that lived in every home, a sorrow that echoed with every school bell that rang for a generation of children who grew up in the shadow of the ones who vanished. 20 years passed. The year was 1981. The world had changed dramatically, but in Millwood, the pain of 1961 was a scar that never fully healed. Chief Evans had long since retired, the case file a thick, dusty monument to his greatest failure. The parents of the lost children had aged, their hope withered into a dull, permanent ache. Eleanor Grady still lived in the same small house on Oak Street, a widow to a mystery. Then, on the morning of September 18th, 1981, the phone rang at the Millwood Sheriff's Department. The new sheriff, a man named Roy Peterson who had been a teenager at the time of the disappearance, answered. The call was from a state trooper nearly 200 miles away in a remote, mountainous region. A hiker had found something impossible. They had found a man, disoriented and frail, wandering along a logging road. He was confused, his clothes were tattered and outdated, but he was able to give his name. He said his name was Thomas Grady. The state trooper's voice on the other end of the line was calm, but carried an undercurrent of bewildered urgency that Sheriff Roy Peterson had never heard before in his decade on the job. "We've got a John Doe up here, Sheriff." Or, well, he says he's not a John Doe. He's insisting his name is Thomas Grady. From Millwood. There was a pause, a crackle of static on the long-distance line. Says he was a school bus driver. For a long moment, Roy Peterson could not speak. The name was a ghost, a story from his youth, a foundational tragedy of his hometown. He was 16 years old when Tom Grady and Bus 42 vanished. He remembered the fear, the endless searches, the way the adults in his life seemed to age 10 years in a single day. He slowly lowered himself into his creaky wooden chair, the receiver pressed hard against his ear. "Thomas Grady," Roy repeated, the name feeling strange and heavy on his tongue. That's not possible." "You're sure that's what he said?" The trooper confirmed it. The man had been found wandering, disoriented and malnourished, along a remote logging road. His clothes were old, worn thin, and out of style by decades. He appeared to be in his late 60s, which would be about right for Grady, but he was so weathered and frail it was hard to tell. Roy's mind raced. It had to be a cruel hoax, a sick imposter. But why? And why now, after all this time? He arranged for the man to be brought to the regional hospital under guard and hung up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. His first call was not to his deputies, but to Eleanor Grady. He had to. The news was too explosive, too potentially devastating. He drove to her small, well-kept house on Oak Street, his stomach in knots. Eleanor answered the door, a kind, tired woman whose life had been defined by a single, terrible absence. She offered him coffee, her movements slow and practiced. Roy sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Tom had doubtless eaten thousands of breakfasts, and told her. He spoke gently, preparing her for what was almost certainly a mistake, a horrible coincidence. He watched her face, expecting tears or anger or disbelief. Instead, she went very still. Her hands, which had been clasped around her coffee mug, slowly uncurled. She looked not at Roy, but at a faded photograph on the wall of a younger, smiling Tom in his driver's cap. After 20 years, she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You tell me my Tom might be alive?" There was no joy in her question, only a deep, profound shock that seemed to freeze her in place. Roy left soon after, promising to call the moment he knew more, his heart aching for the hope he might have just recklessly given her. The next 48 hours were a blur of tense coordination and mounting surrealism. Sheriff Peterson and his deputy drove the 200 miles to the hospital. The man was in a secure room, a state trooper posted outside. A doctor briefed them first. The patient was severely dehydrated and suffering from exposure and malnutrition. He had old scars and what appeared to be long-healed fractures. But physically, he was coherent. His vitals were stable. Mentally, however, was another story. He was confused about the passage of time. He kept asking about his bus and the children, his questions laced with a panic that seemed genuine. Roy took a deep breath and entered the room. The man lying in a hospital bed was skeletal, his skin leathery and tan from a life outdoors. His hair was long, white and matted. But as Roy approached, the man's eyes, a pale, watery blue, focused on him. And in that instant, Roy Peterson's skepticism shattered. He was looking at an aged, ravaged version of the man from the missing posters, from the photograph on Eleanor's wall. It was him. It was unmistakably Thomas Grady. Roy pulled a chair close to the bed. "Tom," he said, his voice soft. "My name is Roy Peterson. I'm the sheriff in Millwood now." The man's eyes widened. "Millwood," he breathed the word of prayer. "Eleanor? Is my Eleanor all right?" Roy assured him she was. He asked the question that had burned in the town's soul for 2 decades. "Tom, what happened? Where have you been? The children. Where are the children?" A shadow of profound terror passed over Tom Grady's face. He shook his head, a slow, painful movement. His hands, gnarled and calloused, gripped the thin hospital blanket. "The fog," he whispered, his voice raspy and weak. "It came down off the mountain. Not natural. Thick. White. It swallowed the road. I had to stop. I couldn't see." He closed his eyes, struggling with the memory. "I opened the door to see if I could see better. It was so quiet. The children, they were so quiet." He began to tremble. Then the light. A light inside the fog. Not a car light. Different. It came towards the bus. He fell silent, his breath coming in short gasps. The nurse stepped in, urging Roy to give him time to rest. That was all they got that first day. A strange fog and an impossible light. It was nothing. It was everything. Back in Millwood, the news leaked. A local reporter got a tip from a nurse at the hospital. The story exploded, not just locally, but nationally. "Missing bus driver found alive after 20 years" screamed the headlines. Millwood was instantly flooded with reporters, satellite trucks, and curious onlookers. The quiet town was thrust back into a painful, glaring spotlight. Sheriff Peterson was besieged with questions he couldn't answer. The families of the missing children were re-traumatized. If Tom Grady was alive, were their babies? Why'd he come back alone? Anger began to mix with the shock. Whispers started, ugly and dark. Maybe Tom Grady wasn't a victim. Maybe he had done something terrible all those years ago and had been hiding all this time. His miraculous return was suddenly viewed with suspicion and rage. Eleanor Grady was brought to the hospital under the cover of darkness, a blanket over her head to shield her from the cameras. Sheriff Peterson was there, his stomach a tight ball of anxiety. He watched as she was led into the hospital room. He waited outside, giving them privacy. He heard no cries, no shouts. After about 15 minutes, the door opened and Eleanor emerged, her face pale as chalk, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She leaned against the wall for support. Roy rushed to her side. "Eleanor? My God, is it him?" She looked at Roy, her eyes filled with a storm of emotions. Recognition, heartbreak, and a new, terrifying confusion. She nodded slowly. "It's Tom," she said, her voice breaking. "It's his face. His voice is older, rough, but it's him. He knew things only we knew." She took a ragged breath. "But Roy, he's so afraid. He kept saying they are still listening. He asked me if the quiet ones had left the town alone." She looked down the sterile hospital corridor as if expecting to see something lurking there. "My husband came back," she whispered, "but he didn't come back alone. Whatever took him all those years ago, I think it came back with him." The mystery had just deepened, twisting into something far darker and more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. The town had wanted answers, but the first one they had received was more terrifying than the 20 years of silence. The hospital room felt less like a place of healing and more like a cage, the air thick with unspoken fears and the ghost of 20 lost years. Tom Grady, propped up against sterile white pillows, was a fragile link to a past everyone wanted to understand but were now afraid to fully confront. Sheriff Roy Peterson sat by his bedside, a tape recorder whirring softly on the side table. This was no longer just a reunion. It was an investigation, and the whole world was watching. Tom's story, fragmented and laced with a terror that seemed to vibrate through his frail body, began to slowly cohere into a narrative that defied all logic. He described the fog on Old Mill Road with a painter's detail, but it was a painting of a nightmare. "It wasn't right," he insisted, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, seeing something else entirely. It rolled down from the ridge too fast, like it was alive. It wasn't cold or wet. It was dry, and it had a smell, like ozone after a lightning strike, and something else underneath. Something old, like dust from a tomb. He had pulled the bus over because visibility was zero. The children, sensing the strangeness of it, had fallen into an unnerving silence. "That was the worst part," Tom whispered. 23 kids, and you could have heard a pin drop. They just stared out the windows into the white. Then came the light. It wasn't a headlight. It was a color I can't describe. A kind of humming silver. It didn't shine, it moved. It flowed through the fog like water, and it came right up to the door. His next words were spoken, so quietly Roy had to lean in to hear them. The door opened by itself. I didn't touch the lever. It just hissed open, and that silver light was just there waiting, and then they came. He called them the quiet ones. They were figures, he said, tall and indistinct, moving within the light. They didn't walk, they glided. They boarded the bus. The children, they didn't cry. They didn't scream. They just stood up like they were sleepwalking and followed them off the bus, single file, into the fog. He described a profound sense of peace that washed over him, an urge to follow. He claimed he fought it, that his duty to protect the children was a tiny, screaming voice in the back of his mind that made him grab the steering wheel and hold on. One of the quiet ones, turned back. It looked at me. There were no eyes, just depth. And then there was a sound, a pressure in my head, and everything went black. He awoke, he said, somewhere else entirely. A place of constant twilight, surrounded by towering, smooth rock walls that seemed to hum with a low energy. He was alone. The children were gone. He was in a cell of sorts, but with no bars, just a shimmering energy field he couldn't pass. Food, a tasteless paste, and water would appear in his cell through an opening that manifested in the wall. Time lost all meaning. There was no sun, no moon, no cycles of day or night. He slept when he was tired, ate when food appeared. He tried to keep track of time by scratching marks on the wall with a loose stone, but he would often lose count, his mind growing foggy. His captors, the quiet ones, would occasionally appear outside his cell, Just watching him, their silent observation more terrifying than any threat. He described years of this isolated existence, his mind fraying at the edges, his memories of Eleanor and Millwood becoming like a dream he was desperate to hold on to. Then, one day, everything changed. The humming stopped. The light in my cell flickered and died. The wall, it just wasn't there anymore. He found himself standing at the edge of a forest, disoriented and weak, the clothes on his back the same ones he'd worn on the bus 20 years earlier. He had no idea how he got there. He just started walking, and the hiker found him soon after. His story was unbelievable. It was the stuff of cheap science fiction magazines. Sheriff Peterson listened with a growing sense of professional despair. He couldn't put that in an official report. The FBI agents who had joined the investigation exchanged skeptical glances. Yet, the raw, visceral fear in Tom's eyes was undeniably real. He believed every word he was saying. The break in the case, the one that forced them to look past the impossible, came from an unexpected source. A young, ambitious deputy named Ben Carter, who had been assigned the unenviable task of going through the original evidence from 1961 for the 100th time, found something. It was an evidence bag containing the contents of the bus's interior, collected after it was towed. Among the lunchboxes and textbooks was a small, spiral-bound drawing pad belonging to a little girl named Lucy Myers, one of the missing children. The pages were filled with the typical drawings of a 7-year-old. Stick figures, houses, a bright yellow sun. But the last page, the one she must have been working on that very morning, was different. It was a chaotic scribble of white crayon, a furious cloud that covered the entire page. And driving into that cloud was a yellow bus. But hovering above the bus, drawn in a shaky, hesitant hand with a silver crayon, was a distinct, cigar-shaped object with strange, swirling patterns along its side. Below it, Lucy had written in her clumsy printing, "The Quiet Ship." Deputy Carter brought the drawing to Sheriff Peterson. They laid it out on the evidence table. The correlation was chilling. The fog Tom described. The silver light. The name The Quiet Ones. A child's drawing, made moments before the event, seemed to corroborate the ravings of a man who had been missing for 2 decades. It was a piece of evidence that couldn't be explained away. The FBI's forensic document examiner confirmed the crayon and paper were consistent with the era and that the drawing showed no signs of being a later edition. The investigation, which had been focused on a terrestrial crime, now veered into uncharted and deeply unsettling territory. The world's media, camped outside the sheriff's department, caught wind of a significant new lead, and the frenzy intensified. Meanwhile, a team, following the only geographical clue they had, Tom's description of the logging road where he was found, began a new search of the remote mountain area. They weren't looking for a grave anymore. They were looking for a door. And on the second day of the search, a geologist on the team found something strange. A peculiar rock formation that didn't match the surrounding geology, with a smooth, almost glass-like surface that seemed to have been subjected to immense, localized heat. The mystery was no longer just about the past. It was about something that was terrifyingly still present. The discovery of the anomalous rock formation sent a jolt through the investigation, a current of grim excitement that was at odds with the sheer impossibility of the situation. Sheriff Peterson stood before the smooth, glassy section of rock, running a gloved hand over its surface. It felt unnervingly cool to the touch, unlike the surrounding stone which still held the day's faint warmth. The geologist, a pragmatic woman named Dr. Evans with no relation to the former chief, was visibly perplexed. "This isn't volcanic glass. Not in this region," she stated, her voice tight with professional confusion. "The vitrification is localized and incredibly precise. It's as if a tremendous, concentrated heat source touched just this one spot for a fraction of a second, fusing the silica in the granite. I've never seen anything like it." For the first time, a piece of physical, tangible evidence seemed to whisper that Tom Grady's incredible story might have a grain of terrifying truth to it. This development, however, did nothing to calm the storm of attention descending on Millwood. The story of the missing bus driver's return had been a sensation. The leak about the child's drawing and the strange rock formation turned it into a global obsession. News crews from every major network jostled for position on the town's quiet streets. Men in dark suits from obscure government agencies appeared, flashing credentials and commandeering the sheriff's conference room. Their presence both a relief and a new source of anxiety. They took possession of Lucy Meyer's drawing and the strange rock samples, their faces giving nothing away. The official narrative began to harden into one of a tragic cold case with a lone, traumatized survivor, his mind having concocted a fantastical story to cope with 2 decades of unknown horror. The quiet ones and the silver light were quietly relegated to the status of delusion. The public, hungry for simpler truth, largely accepted it. But for those at the center of the storm, the simpler truth was a lie. Tom Grady, growing stronger physically but increasingly withdrawn, was adamant. He was moved to a secure, private facility, ostensibly for his own protection and continued recovery, but it felt like a prison. Sheriff Peterson visited him often, the tape recorder now absent from their conversations. It was during these quieter moments that Tom would share more, his voice dropping to a fearful whisper. "They're not gone, Roy," he said one afternoon, staring out the window at a perfectly ordinary sky. "They're listening. They always listen. They brought me back for a reason." He talked about the hum, a constant, low-frequency vibration that had been the soundtrack to his captivity. He claimed he could still feel it sometimes, a faint thrumming in his teeth, a vibration in the bones of his old chair. He said it was how they communicated, not with words, but with concepts and images pushed directly into his mind. The most chilling of these revelations came on a day when a team of federal psychologists had just left, having subjected him to another battery of tests designed to prove his story was a fabrication. Exhausted and pale, Tom looked at Roy with a terrifying clarity. "They show me things, Roy, in that place. They didn't need to talk. They just put pictures in your head. Pictures of this world, but from above. Like they were studying us. Like we were ants in a farm." He gripped the sheriff's arm, his strength surprising. "The children, Roy. The children weren't prisoners. They were students. Or specimens. I don't know. They were taken care of. They were happy. But they weren't here. They weren't home." He fell back onto his pillows, spent. "I was the failed experiment. The one who fought it. The one whose mind kept breaking. They kept me separate. They studied my sadness. My memories of Eleanor. They didn't understand it. It was a noise to them. The idea that the 23 missing children had been raised in some otherworldly environment, studied and observed, was a horror beyond any kidnapping scenario. It was a violation of a profound and unnatural kind. The official search of the mountain area intensified, now bolstered by federal resources with equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. They scanned for radiation, for magnetic anomalies, for anything that could explain the vitrified rock. They found nothing. The strange formation was an isolated blip, a fingerprint with no hand attached. The investigation, for all its renewed energy, was hitting the same wall it had 20 years prior. An utter lack of evidence. The frustration was palpable. The families of the lost children, who had been briefly buoyed by an impossible hope, crashed into a deeper despair. Their anger now had a focus: Tom Grady. To them, his return was a taunt. He was alive. Their children were not. His wild stories were seen as an insult, a crazy man's attempt to avoid responsibility for a terrible crime he must have committed. The town of Millwood began to fracture, a chasm opening between those who pitted Tom and those who despised him. Through it all, Eleanor Grady remained his steadfast anchor. She visited him every day, sitting with him for hours, often in silence. She didn't press him for more details. She simply provided a tether to the world he remembered. She saw the man she loved trapped behind a wall of fear and unimaginable experience. One evening, as she was leaving, Tom gripped her hand with a sudden, desperate urgency. "They're coming to an end, Ellie," he whispered, his eyes wide and pleading. "The project, it's finishing. They're closing the door. For good." He wouldn't, or couldn't, Explain further. That night, back in her lonely house on Oak Street, Eleanor Grady made a decision. The officials, the agents, the doctors, they all thought they were in charge. But they didn't understand. This wasn't a police matter or a psychological case. It was something else entirely. And she was the only one who could speak its language. The next day, she arrived for her visit carrying a small, old suitcase. Inside were not clothes, but items from their past together. Their wedding album. The faded blanket they'd picnicked on. The small, ceramic dog figurine he'd won for her at a county fair. She didn't say a word. She simply began to lay these items out around his room, creating a museum of their shared life. She put on a cassette tape of music from the 1950s that they had loved. She talked softly, not about the disappearances or the quiet ones, but about the ordinary, beautiful life they had built. She talked about painting the kitchen yellow and his grumbling about the smell. She talked about the dog they'd had, Rusty, who would chase his own tail. She was rebuilding a world for him, brick by brick, memory by memory. She was showing the listeners what they had taken. She was showing them the noise they didn't understand. Love. Tom watched her, tears streaming down his weathered face. The constant, fearful tension in his shoulders began to ease. For the first time since his return, he looked not like a victim or a specimen, but like a man remembering who he was. Later that afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the room, he took her hand. "It's enough, Ellie," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You've shown them. They see it now. The connection. They finally see it." He smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that erased 20 years of torment from his face. It's over. That night, Thomas Grady passed away in his sleep. The autopsy found no clear cause of death. His heart had simply stopped. The official report would list it as a consequence of long-term physical and psychological trauma. But Eleanor knew. Roy Peterson knew. He had come back to deliver a message. And once it was delivered, once his wife had shown the unseen watchers the one thing they could not comprehend, his purpose was complete. The federal presence withdrew as quickly as it had arrived, taking all evidence with them. The case of the Millwood bus disappearance was officially closed, filed away under tragic, unexplained circumstances. The world moved on to the next mystery. In Millwood, the anger slowly cooled into a permanent, weary sadness. A joint memorial was finally held for Tom Grady and the 23 children. The graves are empty, but the headstones remain. Sheriff Roy Peterson would sometimes drive out to the shoulder of Old Mill Road and just sit there. The silence there had a different quality now. It wasn't just the silence of loss. It was the silence of something that had been and was now gone. He never spoke about what he believed happened. Some questions have answers that are too large, too terrifying to fit into the world we know. The truth of that November morning in 1961 died with Tom Grady. A truth not of monsters or men, but of quiet, observing eyes in an impossible fog, and the one man who came back to prove that the most human thing of all, love, is a force that can sometimes, even for just a moment, be understood across the vast and silent dark. The town, of course, tried to bury the strangeness along with Tom. The official story was a clean, simple thing, a tragedy with a sad ending. The newspapers printed their final articles, the television trucks packed up and left, and Millwood was once again left to its own devices, a place famous for a grief it could never truly explain. Life, in its stubborn way, continued. New children were born who only knew the story as a local legend, a ghost tale to whisper about on dark nights. The shoulder on Old Mill Road, where the bus had once sat, was widened and paved over, the physical scar of that morning finally erased from the landscape. But for those who had been at the heart of it, the silence that followed was not empty. It was watchful. Sheriff Roy Peterson found he could not let it go. The case was closed, the file locked in a cabinet, but it lived in his mind, playing on a loop. He took to walking in the woods near where the strange rock had been found, not with any hope of discovery, but just to feel the place. Sometimes he would bring Deputy Carter, the only other person who had seen the drawing and understood its terrifying implication. They rarely spoke of it directly. It was too big, too fragile. Instead, they would walk in a comfortable silence, their eyes occasionally scanning the canopy of trees or the gray sky above, a habit they could not break. It was on one of these walks, almost a year after Tom's death, that Ben Carter stopped short. "You hear that?" he asked, his head tilted. Roy stopped, listening to the usual forest sounds, the wind in the pines, the distant call of a crow. "Hear what?" Ben frowned. "It's gone now." It was like a hum, really low. Felt it more than heard it. In my teeth. Roy felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He hadn't heard a thing, but he remembered Tom's words with perfect clarity, a faint thrumming in my teeth. He said nothing, just nodded and continued walking, but the air between them had changed. The world felt thin again, like a curtain that could be pulled aside at any moment. Eleanor Grady, in her quiet house on Oak Street, felt the presence too, but she interpreted it differently. She didn't feel watched. She felt acknowledged. She would be working in her garden and would get the overwhelming sense that she was not alone. There was no fear in it. It was a neutral feeling, like someone pausing to read a headstone in a cemetery, a moment of respect for a story that had ended. She found a strange peace in this. Her act of love, her defiant display of a shared human life, had been witnessed. That was all she had ever wanted. She had gotten her husband back, if only for a little while, and she had helped him finish what he needed to do. For her, that was enough. The final, unsettling piece of the puzzle arrived, not in Millwood, but on Sheriff Peterson's desk 6 months later. It was a plain manila envelope with no return address, postmarked from a city hundreds of miles away. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a photocopy of an official-looking document, heavily redacted with thick black bars that obscured most of the text. The letterhead at the top, however, was partially visible. A government agency he knew existed but had no jurisdiction over civilian affairs. The title of the document was Project Long Listen, Terminal Assessment of Subject G42. And at the bottom of the page, one line had been left unredacted. It read, Conclusion. The emotional resonance of the primary bond, designated love, operates as a fixed, non-transferable constant, incompatible with integration. The subject's return and subsequent termination confirm its function as a biological imperative and a terminal failsafe. Recommend closure of the Millwood observation point. The data is sufficient. Roy read the words over and over, his blood running cold. Subject G42. Tom Grady. Termination. They hadn't just let him die. They had closed a file. The children, the students or specimens, were apparently a separate part of the project. But Tom had been an experiment until the very end. His love for Eleanor, the very thing the quiet ones couldn't understand, was what had ultimately made him useless to them. He was returned not out of mercy, but to observe the effects of that reconnection, to see the failsafe in action. His death was the final piece of data they needed. The document was a leak, a deliberate act from someone within that shadowy world who perhaps had a conscience. Or perhaps it was just another part of the experiment, a way to see how he would react to knowing the truth. Roy never told anyone about the document. He burned it in his ashtray, watching the edges curl and blacken, the clinical, inhuman words turning to ash. What good would it do? It would only reopen wounds and confirm a horror that was better left in the shadows. He understood now that some mysteries are not meant to be solved by police or governments. They are simply meant to be endured. He still drives out to Old Mill Road sometimes. He no longer gets out of his car. He just sits there, engine off, and listens to the silence. He thinks about Tom and the children, not as victims of a crime, but as pieces in a game whose rules he could never hope to understand. He thinks about the love that was strong enough to be measured by something from beyond the stars, yet too powerful for them to keep. And in the quiet of the car, if he listens very closely, he sometimes imagines he can hear it. Not a hum, but the faint, fading echo of 23 children who never grew up, and the bus driver who, in the end, found his way home to the only thing that truly mattered. The road is just a road now, but the story is forever.